Mafia boss married a fat girl for a bet of $5 million, but her transformation shocked him. The crystal glasses clinked against fine china as laughter echoed through the private dining room of Milano's, Detroit's most exclusive Italian restaurant. Elisa Moretti stood frozen behind the partially opened door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She'd only come looking for the restroom. But Giovanni De Luca's deep voice had stopped her in her tracks. $5 million? Giovanni's smooth tone carried across the room. To marry the Moretti girl for a year. He let out a low chuckle that sent ice through Elisa's veins. That's hardly a challenge, Marco. She's been following me around like a lost puppy since we were kids. Elisa's fingers dug into the doorframe. The plush carpet beneath her feet suddenly felt unsteady as Giovanni's words hit her like physical blows. Come on, Giovanni, another voice joined in. When's the last time you even looked at her? The girl's what, 50 pounds overweight? 70 at least, someone else added, triggering another round of cruel laughter. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. Elisa's cheeks burned. She'd always known what people thought of her, but hearing it laid bare like this, especially from Giovanni, made her want to disappear into the floor. So, what do you say, De Luca? The first voice pressed. Marry her? Keep her for a year? Prove you can do it. $5 million says you can't. There was a pause, and Elisa found herself holding her breath. Surely Giovanni, who she'd known since they were children, who she'd secretly loved for years, wouldn't. Done. The word fell like a death sentence. It'll be easy enough. She's desperate for attention, always has been. One smile from me and she'll say yes before I finish asking. The crystal glasses clinked again in celebration, but Elisa barely heard them over the roaring in her ears. Her chest felt too tight, each breath a struggle as she stumbled backward from the door. She made it to her car somehow, though she couldn't remember the walk through the restaurant. The leather seat caught her tears as they finally fell, hot and heavy down her cheeks. Every memory of Giovanni, every shared childhood moment, every secret smile she thought they'd shared, every flutter of her heart when he entered a room, turned to ash in her mouth. Her apartment welcomed her with familiar silence. The lights flickered on automatically as she entered, illuminating the space she'd made her sanctuary. But tonight, even the comfort of home felt hollow. Elisa found herself standing before the full-length mirror in her bedroom, really looking at herself for the first time in years. The woman who stared back wore a black dress that strained slightly at the seams, designed to hide rather than flatter. Her brown hair hung limp around a face that might have been pretty if it wasn't so round. Her eyes, usually bright with warmth, now shimmered with tears. The fat girl, she whispered to her reflection, Giovanni's cruel laughter echoing in her mind. The one no one notices. But as she stood there, something shifted in her chest. The crushing pain of humiliation began to crystallize into something harder, something sharp-edged and dangerous. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. You want to marry me for a bet, Giovanni? Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried steel. You think I'm just going to fall at your feet like I always have? The woman in the mirror straightened her spine, shoulders squaring with newfound purpose. 6 months. She had 6 months before the social season when Giovanni would likely make his move. 6 months to transform herself into someone he wouldn't recognize. Someone who could make him regret every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every moment he'd treated her as less than she was. Her tears dried on her cheeks as determination took root. Giovanni De Luca thought she was an easy target, a guaranteed win for his $5 million. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The high-end fitness center loomed before Elisa, all gleaming glass and polished steel. Her reflection in the entrance doors showed the same woman she'd always been, but her eyes held a different kind of fire now. The membership fee had made her wince, 3 months' worth of her savings, but she refused to settle for anything less than the best. Inside, the smell of eucalyptus and clean sweat filled her lungs. Exercise machines worth more than her car lined the walls, while Detroit's elite worked out in coordinated athletic wear that probably cost more than her monthly rent. "Miss Moretti?" A tall woman with the kind of body Elisa had only seen in magazines approached. "I'm Amanda, your personal trainer." Elisa gripped her oversized gym bag tighter. "I want the most intensive program you offer." Amanda's perfectly shaped eyebrow rose. "Our elite program is demanding. Most clients start with something more basic." "I don't want basic," Elisa cut in, her voice firm. "I have 6 months to completely transform myself. Money isn't an issue." It was a lie. She'd maxed out 2 credit cards for this, but she wouldn't let anything stop her now. Amanda studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, let's start with a fitness assessment." The next 2 hours were brutal. Every muscle screamed as Amanda put her through a series of tests. Elisa's lungs burned, sweat soaked through her cheap workout clothes, and more than once she thought she might throw up. But each time Giovanni's mocking laughter echoed in her head, she pushed harder. "Your current fitness level is..." Amanda consulted her tablet. "Before average. But I see potential. You've got determination. That's half the battle." "I need more than just training," Elisa said, still breathing hard. "Diet plans, nutritionist consultations, whatever it takes. We can arrange that. But this won't be easy. You'll need to commit completely." Elisa thought of Giovanni's casual cruelty, of the bet that reduced her worth to a dollar amount. "I'm ready." The weeks that followed tested every ounce of her resolve. She was at the gym every morning at 5 a.m., pushing through workouts that left her trembling. Her nutritionist replaced her comfort foods with carefully measured portions and proteins she could barely pronounce. Every muscle ached, every step hurt, but she refused to quit. At night, she researched fashion blogs and style magazines, studying how wealthy women carried themselves. She practiced walking in heels until her feet bled, watched YouTube videos on makeup application until her eyes burned. This wasn't just about losing weight. It was about becoming someone new entirely. 2 months into her transformation, Elisa stood outside Valentina's, Detroit's most exclusive boutique. Her body had already started changing, not dramatically, but enough that she'd needed new clothes. The store's window display showcased a red dress that would have made her flinch away before. Today, she reached for the door. Across the street, Giovanni De Luca sat in his black Mercedes, his eyes fixed on the woman entering the boutique. He'd been monitoring Elisa's movements, a habit born from years of keeping tabs on potential assets. But something about her stride made him pause. She moved differently now, with a confidence he'd never seen before. Her clothes, while still conservative, hinted at subtle curves he hadn't noticed. Her hair caught the sunlight, and for a moment, he found himself wondering what it would feel like between his fingers. When she emerged from the store, shopping bag in hand, Giovanni's breath caught. She'd changed into her purchase, a cream-colored sweater dress that hugged her softening curves, paired with heels that made her legs look endless. She wasn't thin, not yet, but there was something magnetic about the way she carried herself. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel as she passed by his car, completely unaware of his presence. The familiar indifference he'd always felt toward her wavered, replaced by something uncomfortable and warm that he refused to name. "It doesn't change anything," he muttered to himself, even as his eyes followed her retreating figure. "A bet's a bet." But for the first time since making the wager, Giovanni felt less certain about his ability to maintain his usual cold detachment. He watched until she disappeared around the corner, then forced himself to look away, ignoring the unsettling attraction that lingered in his chest. Giovanni's Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor of his office as he approached Elisa. She sat perfectly poised in the visitor's chair, her transformation evident in everything from her sleek business attire to her straight-backed posture. The sight of her made something twist in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation he chose to ignore. "Let's keep this simple," he said, leaning against his desk. "Marriage. 1 year. After that, we go our separate ways." Elisa's green eyes met his, unwavering. The timid girl who used to look away was gone. "And what do I get out of this arrangement?" $2 million. He watched for any flicker of emotion, but her face remained neutral. "Plus all living expenses covered during our association." "Association?" A small smile played at her lips. "Is that what we're calling it?" Giovanni's jaw tightened. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. The old Elisa would have crumbled, maybe even cried. This woman before him was different, controlled, almost amused. "The terms are simple," he continued. "You'll live in my house, attend necessary social functions, play the role of devoted wife. When the year is up, you walk away wealthy, and I never have to see you again." "And if I refuse?" "Then I find someone else." He shrugged, maintaining his cold facade even as something inside him rebelled at the thought. Elisa stood, smoothing her pencil skirt. She'd lost enough weight that her curves were more defined now, though still generous. "I accept." Giovanni blinked. "Just like that?" "Just like that." She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her expensive perfume. "But let me be clear, Giovanni. I'm not the same girl you used to mock. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for me." 3 weeks later, the cathedral was filled with Detroit's criminal elite. Flowers worth a small fortune decorated every surface, and security men disguised as guests watched every entrance. Giovanni stood at the altar, his black tuxedo immaculate, his expression carved from stone. The wedding march began, and heads turned as Elisa appeared at the entrance. Giovanni's breath caught in his throat. The woman walking toward him was stunning. Her dress, a masterpiece of Italian design, hugged her new figure perfectly. The transformed curves that had been hinted at in her everyday clothes were now on full display, elegant and sensual. Her dark hair fell in soft waves, and her makeup enhanced features he'd never properly noticed before. She moved with grace that spoke of hours of practice, each step deliberate and confident. The guests whispered. They'd all known the fat girl Giovanni was marrying. This vision in white defied their expectations. Giovanni forced his expression to remain neutral, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't part of the plan. He was supposed to endure a year with the awkward friend from his childhood. Instead, he was watching a woman who could turn heads in any room, approach him with the air of someone who knew her own worth. The ceremony passed in a blur of words and rituals. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Elisa turned to face him. The look in her eyes sent a chill down his spine, not of fear, but of something far more dangerous. She knew the power she held now, and Giovanni had the unsettling feeling that his carefully constructed plan was about to backfire. As they walked back down the aisle, her hand resting lightly on his arm, the tension between them was palpable. Giovanni maintained his distance, his touch impersonal, his demeanor cold. But he couldn't ignore the electricity that crackled in the space between them, or the way his body responded to her proximity. Elisa's smile never wavered, but there was steel behind it. She'd agreed to this marriage on her terms, and Giovanni was beginning to realize that the game he'd started might not play out the way he'd intended. The marble floors echoed with Elisa's heels as she walked through their new home. The mansion sprawled before her, all polished surfaces and expensive furnishings. Giovanni's territory, her prison, her opportunity. "Your room is in the East Wing," Giovanni said, his voice clipped and professional. He stood with his hands in his pockets, maintaining a careful distance. "Mine is in the West. The staff has been informed of our arrangement." Elisa nodded, taking in the grand staircase and crystal chandelier. "Perfect. I assume I have free access to all areas?" "Except my office and private quarters." His dark eyes narrowed slightly. "Those are off limits." "Of course." She smiled, all business. "I wouldn't dream of invading your space, Giovanni. This is just a contract, after all." Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, at her easy acceptance. He'd expected tears, maybe, or attempts to win his affection. Instead, she treated their marriage like the business arrangement it was. Over the next few days, Elisa settled into a routine. She worked out in the private gym, took meetings with social coordinators, and reviewed the household accounts. When Giovanni was home, she maintained a polite distance, speaking only when necessary. But her eyes told a different story. Whenever their gazes met across the dinner table or in passing hallways, she held his stare with quiet defiance. It was a challenge he couldn't quite decode, and it unnerved him more than he cared to admit. One morning, Giovanni found her in the kitchen, dressed in workout clothes that highlighted her transformed figure. She was studying paperwork while sipping coffee, completely ignoring his presence. "The Castellano dinner is tonight," he said, breaking the silence. "You'll be expected to attend." Elisa looked up, her green eyes sharp. "I know. I've already selected an appropriate dress and reviewed the guest list. I assume you want me to play the devoted wife?" "Just be presentable and quiet," he replied, his jaw tightening. "I'm always presentable now, aren't I?" She stood, gathering her papers. As she passed him, her perfume, something expensive and subtle, caught his attention. "Don't worry, Giovanni. I won't embarrass you in front of your friends." The dinner that evening proved her words true. Elisa charmed the other Mafia wives, navigated political conversations with ease, and maintained the perfect balance of attention and discretion. Giovanni watched her from across the room, noticing how heads turned when she laughed, how confidently she carried herself in her designer dress. Days turned into weeks. Elisa's presence in the house became impossible to ignore. She filled spaces he'd never noticed were empty, brought life to rooms that had been merely functional. Her morning workouts became part of his daily distraction. The sight of her in the gym, strong and focused, made his collar feel too tight. In meetings with his associates, she sat quietly observant, occasionally offering insights that proved surprisingly valuable. She wasn't just playing at being his wife. She was becoming a force in his world. A month into their arrangement, Giovanni stood in his office, watching through the window as Elisa returned from a charity luncheon. She stepped out of the car with practiced grace, her fitted dress showcasing curves that now drew admiring glances wherever she went. But it wasn't just her physical transformation that caught his attention. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence that seemed to grow stronger each day. His fingers tightened around his whiskey glass as she glanced up at his window, catching his gaze. That familiar challenge flashed in her eyes before she looked away, disappearing into the house. Giovanni threw back his drink, trying to drown the tension building in his chest. It wasn't just physical attraction, though that was becoming harder to deny. It was something more dangerous, something that threatened the careful walls he'd built around himself. The grand ballroom of the Palazzo Vittoria sparkled with crystal chandeliers and dangerous men in expensive suits. Elisa stood at the entrance, her emerald dress catching the light. Giovanni's hand rested on the small of her back, the first time he'd touched her all evening, as he guided her through the crowd of Italy's most notorious crime families. Her heart raced at his touch, but she kept her expression neutral. This wasn't the childhood friend she'd known anymore. This was Giovanni De Luca, the Mafia boss who commanded respect with just a glance. "Remember," he murmured close to her ear, "these people aren't your friends. Watch what you say." "I know how to handle myself," she replied quietly, maintaining her smile as they approached a group of men. The evening unfolded like a dangerous dance. Elisa watched Giovanni move through conversations with practiced ease, noting how others deferred to him. Violence lurked beneath the surface of every polite exchange, every careful smile. She recognized some faces from news reports, men linked to crimes that had never been proven. "Your wife is stunning, Giovanni," said Marco Russo, an aging Don whose smile didn't reach his eyes. "Such a transformation from the girl we remember." Elisa felt Giovanni's fingers flex against her back. "She's always been remarkable," he said, his voice carrying a warning edge that surprised her. As they circled the room, Elisa caught fragments of conversation about territory disputes and business deals that made her skin crawl. Yet she found herself fascinated by this world, by the power dynamics, the subtle threats wrapped in pleasantries, the way Giovanni commanded respect without raising his voice. During dinner, she sat beside him, aware of every slight movement he made. When she reached for her wineglass, their fingers brushed. The contact sent electricity through her body, but she didn't pull away. Neither did he. "You're doing well," he said softly, his lips barely moving. The praise shouldn't have affected her, but it did. She turned her head slightly, meeting his dark gaze. "Surprised?" Something flickered in his eyes, appreciation perhaps, or hunger. Before he could respond, gunshots shattered the evening's facade of civility. Chaos erupted. In seconds, Giovanni had her pressed against the wall, shielding her with his body. His gun appeared in his hand as if by magic. The weight of him against her, the heat of his breath on her neck. It was overwhelming. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice rough with tension. The shooting stopped as quickly as it had started. A warning from a rival family, she learned later. But Giovanni's protective stance didn't relax until they were safely in their car, speeding away from the palazzo. Back at the mansion, he followed her to her room. The adrenaline still coursed through their veins, making the air between them thick with tension. Elisa's hands shook slightly as she reached for her door handle. "Wait!" Giovanni's command stopped her. He stepped closer, invading her space. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, tilting her face up to his. The touch was possessive, almost cruel in its gentleness. His eyes burned into hers, searching for something she couldn't name. "You could have gotten killed tonight," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm fine," she whispered, fighting to keep her breathing steady. His thumb brushed across her bottom lip, and she saw his control slip for just a moment. The indifference he'd worn, like armor, cracked, revealing something dark and wanting underneath. "This is my world, Elisa," he said roughly. "There's no going back now." His fingers lingered on her skin, marking her with an invisible brand. Then, as suddenly as he'd approached, he stepped back, leaving her breathless and confused in the doorway of her room. The night stretched long and dark around them as they sat in Giovanni's study. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across his sharp features. Elisa watched him from her position on the leather armchair, noting how the flames reflected in his glass of whiskey. "My father killed his first man when he was 14, Giovanni said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was devoid of emotion, as if reciting a grocery list. "He made me watch my first execution when I was 12. Elisa's breath caught, but she remained still, afraid any movement might break this rare moment of openness. "The man had stolen from our family," Giovanni continued, his eyes fixed on the amber liquid in his glass. "Father wanted me to understand the price of betrayal. I remember the way the man begged." His jaw tightened. "Father said crying was weakness. He beat me that night for showing fear." The firelight cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the scars she'd never noticed before. Thin white lines near his hairline, a barely visible mark along his jaw. "By 15, I had my own crew. 16, my first kill." He took a slow sip of whiskey. "There was never a choice, Elisa. This life, it owns you before you're born. The blood runs in your veins whether you want it or not." She watched his knuckles whiten around the glass. These hands had killed, had orchestrated violence she couldn't imagine. Yet they were the same hands that had protected her at the palazzo, that had touched her face with surprising gentleness. "Your mother?" she asked softly. A muscle twitched in his cheek. "Dead by the time I was 8. Rival family." His voice turned harder, colder. "Father had them all executed, of course. Made me watch that, too. Said I needed to learn what happened to anyone who touched what belonged to a DeLuca." Elisa's heart ached despite herself. She saw him now, the little boy forced to grow up too fast, shaped by violence and loss into this man of steel and ice. "The lessons never stopped," Giovanni continued, standing to pour another drink. His movements were controlled, precise. "Every weakness had to be eliminated. Every emotion buried." "Love?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Love gets you killed in this world. Trust gets your family slaughtered." He turned to face her, and for a moment, she saw something crack in his perfect mask, a glimpse of raw pain quickly hidden away. "That's why this arrangement works," he said, his voice growing distant again. "Clean. Simple. No complications." But Elisa saw through the lie. She saw how his hands shook slightly as he set down his glass, how his shoulders carried the weight of years of forced brutality. The man before her was more than the cold-blooded mafia boss who'd made that cruel bet. He was damaged, broken in ways that made her own heart ache. "Giovanni," she whispered, standing slowly. He stiffened, as if her soft tone had physically struck him. "Don't," he warned. "Don't look at me like that. Like you understand, like you—" He cut himself off, turning back to the fire. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Elisa wanted to reach out, to offer comfort she knew he wouldn't accept. But she remembered the bet, remembered why she was here. Her heart might break for the broken boy he'd been, but she couldn't let herself fall for the man he'd become. Still, as she watched him stare into the flames, his profile harsh and beautiful in the firelight, Something shifted inside her. The cruel mask he wore made more sense now. The coldness, the control, the inability to trust. They were armor forged in childhood tragedy and honed by years of violence. She left him there by the fire, her steps quiet on the thick carpet. But as she closed the study door behind her, she knew something had changed. The wall between them had cracked, revealing the wounded soul beneath the monster. And despite her best efforts, despite all her promises to herself, she couldn't unsee it. Giovanni's jaw clenched as he watched Elisa across the crowded ballroom. She wore a dark red dress that hugged every curve of her transformed body, her hair falling in loose waves down her back. The sight of her made his blood run hot, a feeling he'd been fighting for weeks now. But it wasn't just her appearance that tortured him. It was the way she carried herself, confident, poised, completely different from the insecure woman he'd known before, the woman he'd so carelessly bet on. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" Marco Rossi, one of his business associates, commented beside him. Giovanni barely heard him. His attention was fixed on Elisa, who was engaged in conversation with Antonio Vitale, a young capo from a friendly family. Antonio leaned close to her, whispering something that made her laugh. The sound carried across the room, and Giovanni's hand tightened around his whiskey glass. "Your wife seems to be enjoying herself," Marco observed, a hint of amusement in his voice. Giovanni shot him a cold look. "She's playing her part." "Is that all it is?" Marco raised an eyebrow. "Because the way you're looking at her—" "Careful," Giovanni warned, his voice dropping dangerously low. But Marco's words hit too close to home. The way he looked at her? How did he look at her? Like a man possessed, probably. Like someone fighting a losing battle against desire. Across the room, Antonio's hand brushed Elisa's arm. The touch was innocent enough, but something dark and primitive roared to life in Giovanni's chest. Before he realized what he was doing, he was moving across the ballroom, his steps measured but purposeful. "Excuse me," he said, his voice arctic as he approached them. "I need to speak with my wife." Antonio stepped back immediately, recognizing the danger in Giovanni's tone. Elisa turned to face him, her eyes challenging. She'd grown bold these past months, no longer the timid woman who would have cowered at his approach. "Of course," she said smoothly. "It was lovely talking with you, Antonio." Giovanni's hand found the small of her back, possessive and firm, as he guided her away from the crowd. He could feel the heat of her skin through the thin material of her dress, and it made his pulse race. They made their way through the mansion's corridors until they reached their private suite. The moment the door closed behind them, Giovanni spun her around, backing her against the wall. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his face inches from hers. "Having a conversation," Elisa replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "Is that not allowed?" "With Antonio Vitale?" His voice was rough with barely controlled emotion. "You were flirting with him." "And if I was?" she challenged, her eyes flashing. "This is just an arrangement, remember? A bet." The reminder stung more than it should have. Giovanni braced one hand against the wall beside her head, caging her in. "You're my wife." "On paper," she shot back. "You made it very clear this meant nothing." He could smell her perfume, something subtle and intoxicating. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, and he couldn't stop his eyes from tracking the movement. When had she become so irresistible? When had this arrangement become such sweet torture? "Nothing," he growled, moving closer until their bodies were almost touching. "Is that what you think?" Elisa's breath hitched, but she didn't back down. "What else should I think, Giovanni? You married me for money, for a bet." The truth of her words sparked something desperate inside him. Without thinking, he closed the last inch between them, his free hand gripping her waist. She gasped at the contact, her eyes darkening. "Tell me," he demanded, his voice rough. "Tell me what he was whispering to you." "Why do you care?" she whispered back, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, not pushing him away, but not pulling him closer either. The heat between them was unbearable. Giovanni could feel her heart racing, matching the frantic pace of his own. He wanted to kiss her, to claim her, to erase any thought of Antonio or anyone else from her mind. But he couldn't. He shouldn't. Instead, he leaned in until his lips brushed her ear. "You're playing with fire, Gara." He felt her shiver, heard the small catch in her breath. When he pulled back slightly, her eyes were dark with desire, her lips parted. The sight nearly broke his control. They stood there, frozen in that moment of electric tension, both of them breathing hard, neither willing to be the first to break. The crystal glasses clinked as laughter echoed through the mansion's study. Elisa paused outside the heavy oak door, her hand frozen mid-reach. Giovanni's voice carried through, that smooth, dangerous tone she'd grown to both love and hate. "It was just business," he said, followed by the sound of liquid being poured. "5 million for a year of marriage? You know me better than that. I never turned down a profitable venture." Elisa's heart stopped. The world tilted sideways as another voice chimed in. "But surely, Giovanni, the way she looks now, you must feel something." "Feel something?" Giovanni's laugh was cold, cutting through her like a blade. "She's a contract, nothing more. The transformation is impressive, I'll give her that. But this was never about feelings." The crystal tumbler in Elisa's hand slipped, shattering against the marble floor. The conversation inside went dead silent. She didn't wait for them to find her. Instead, she pushed the door open, her heels crunching over broken glass. Giovanni stood by his desk, whiskey in hand, surrounded by 3 of his associates. His expression flickered for just a moment before settling back into that impenetrable mask. "Elisa," he started, but she cut him off. "Don't." Her voice shook, but she held her chin high. "Don't you dare try to explain this away." The other men shifted uncomfortably, but she barely noticed them. Her focus was entirely on Giovanni, on the way he set his glass down with deliberate care, on how his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Leave us," he commanded, not taking his eyes off her. The others filed out quickly, the door closing behind them with a heavy thud. "A contract?" Elisa's laugh was bitter. "Is that all I am to you? A business transaction?" Giovanni's expression remained carefully neutral. "You knew what this was from the beginning." "Did I?" She stepped closer, her hands trembling. "Because I thought maybe, just maybe, something had changed. That all those moments, all those times you looked at me like—" She stopped herself, swallowing hard. "But I was wrong, wasn't I? I was just fooling myself."
"Elisa."
"No!" She slammed her hand down on his desk. "You don't get to say my name like that. Like you care. I heard you, Giovanni. Crystal clear. $5 million for a year of your time. That's my worth to you." Something flickered in his eyes, something that looked almost like pain. But Elisa was done looking for meaning in his expressions, done trying to read between the lines. "You want to know the worst part?"
Her voice dropped to a whisper.
I actually started to believe you might see me differently now. That maybe the bet was just the beginning, and something real was growing between us.
Giovanni moved toward her, his movement predatory, controlled. You're upset. We should discuss this when you're calmer.
Calmer?
The word exploded from her.
I'm not one of your business associates you can dismiss when things get uncomfortable. I'm your wife!
On paper, he said, his words echoing her earlier taunts back at her. The sting of those words brought angry tears to her eyes.
You're right. That's all this is. A paper marriage. A contract.
She pulled off her wedding ring, the diamond catching the light as she set it on his desk.
Consider this my 2 weeks' notice.
For the first time, real emotion crossed Giovanni's face. Something raw and almost desperate. He reached for her, but she stepped back.
Don't touch me,
she said, her voice ice cold.
You've made it very clear where we stand. $5 million for a year of marriage? Congratulations, Giovanni. You've gotten exactly what you paid for.
She turned and walked toward the door, her steps steady despite the storm raging inside her. She could feel his eyes on her back, could
almost taste the tension in the air. Elisa, wait. She paused at the door but didn't turn around. Save it for someone who still believes your lies. The door closed behind her with a final click, leaving Giovanni alone in his study, staring at the wedding ring glinting on his desk. The first time in his life, he'd truly lost something he hadn't known he needed. The gym was empty at 5 a.m., just how Elisa liked it. Sweat dripped down her spine as she pushed through another set of deadlifts, the weight heavy enough to demand her complete focus. Her muscles burned, but she welcomed the pain. It was better than the hollow ache in her chest. Again, her trainer Marcus commanded, his voice echoing in the empty space. Elisa gripped the bar, her form perfect after months of practice. As she lifted, she channeled every ounce of hurt into raw power. The bar came up smooth, controlled. She held it at the top, jaw clenched. Good, Marcus nodded. Your form is getting better every day. She lowered the weight, then straightened, wiping her face with a towel. I want to add more weight next time. Marcus studied her carefully. You're pushing yourself hard lately, harder than usual. Is that a problem? Her tone carried an edge that hadn't been there before. Not if you're doing it for the right reasons. Elisa turned away, moving to the rowing machine. She didn't want to talk about reasons. She didn't want to talk at all. The rhythmic pull of the machine filled the silence, her breathing steady and controlled. After the gym, she headed straight to her office. She'd thrown herself into work, taking on new clients for her consulting business. The familiar weight of her laptop felt more comforting than the ghost of her wedding ring. Her assistant Sarah placed a coffee on her desk. Your 9 a.m. canceled, but Mr. Romano wants to move up his appointment to discuss the merger. Schedule it, Elisa said, not looking up from her screen. And get me the files on the Carter acquisition. Already on your desk? Sarah hesitated. There's also Mr. DeLuca called. Again. Elisa's fingers stilled on the keyboard. The same answer as always. He said it's about business. It's always about business with him. Elisa finally looked up, her expression neutral, but her eyes hard. Tell him to contact our lawyers if it's important. The day passed in a blur of meetings and spreadsheets. When evening came, Elisa headed to her boxing class. The gym was different from her morning workout spot, grittier, with the sharp smell of leather and sweat. Her knuckles connected with the heavy bag, each hit precise and calculated. Left jab, right cross, left hook. The combination flowed naturally now, muscle memory taking over. "You're getting stronger," her instructor commented, holding the bag steady. "Your strikes have real power behind them." Elisa didn't respond, just kept hitting. Each punch carried the weight of Giovanni's words. Contract. Nothing more. The bag swayed under her assault. After class, she walked to her car alone, the cool night air a relief against her heated skin. The parking lot was poorly lit, but she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Her keys were already in her hand, her stance alert and ready. Another habit she'd developed. She sensed him before she saw him. Giovanni stood in the shadows near her car, his presence as commanding as ever. But Elisa didn't falter, didn't speed up or slow down. She kept her pace steady, her chin high. He watched her, his dark eyes intense in the dim light. She could feel the weight of his gaze, could almost taste the tension in the air between them. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of acknowledgement. As she unlocked her car, she caught his reflection in the window. His hands were clenched at his sides, his jaw tight. She recognized the look. It was the same one he wore when dealing with a situation he couldn't control. Good, she thought. Let him feel what it's like to be powerless for once. She slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away without a backward glance. But in her rearview mirror, she could still see him standing there, a dark figure in the shadows, watching her disappear into the night. Giovanni remained motionless, his eyes fixed on her taillights until they vanished around the corner. His chest felt tight, constricted by emotions he couldn't name. She was slipping away from him, becoming someone new, someone stronger, harder, more brilliant than before. And for the first time in his life, Giovanni De Luca wasn't sure if his power and money could give him what he needed most. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Giovanni's office as he stared at his phone. Elisa's number glared back at him, mocking his hesitation. He'd never struggled with words before. Commands came naturally to a man in his position. But this wasn't about giving orders. This was about something he'd never had to do before. Apologize. He pressed dial. 1 ring. 2 rings. 3.
This is Elisa Moretti. Please leave a message.
His jaw clenched. Direct to voicemail. Again. He ended the call without leaving a message, tossing the phone onto his desk with more force than necessary. The sound echoed in the silent office. "Cancel my afternoon meetings," he barked into the intercom. He found her at her favorite cafe, the one she'd started frequenting since moving out of their shared mansion. She sat alone, laptop open, a half-empty cup of coffee beside her. The sunlight caught her hair, highlighting the subtle changes in her appearance. She'd lost more weight, gained more muscle. But it was her eyes that had changed the most. They were sharper now, harder. "We need to talk," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. Elisa didn't look up from her screen.
I'm working.
"Elisa." His voice carried that edge of command that usually made people scramble to attention. She closed her laptop with deliberate slowness, finally meeting his gaze. "What do you want, Giovanni?" "I want to explain." "Explain what?" Her voice was cool, controlled. "How you used me for a bet? How you thought so little of me that you were willing to gamble with my life, my feelings." "It wasn't like that." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Things changed. You changed. I changed?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "No, Giovanni. I just stopped being the convenient target for your cruelty." Her words hit him like physical blows. He was used to violence, to threats, to the constant dance of power in his world. But this quiet dismissal from the woman who'd somehow become essential to him, this was different. "I'm trying to apologize," he growled, frustration bleeding into his tone. "Are you?" She raised an eyebrow. "Because it sounds like you're trying to justify yourself. Again." She started packing up her things, each movement precise and controlled. Giovanni's hands itched to stop her, to grab her and make her listen. But he knew that would only push her further away. "I made a mistake," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "You made a choice," she corrected him, standing. "Several of them, actually. And now you're living with the consequences." She walked away, leaving him sitting there, surrounded by the quiet murmur of the cafe and the crushing weight of his own failures. Giovanni De Luca, the man who commanded an empire built on fear and respect, watched helplessly as the one person he needed walked away from him. Later that day, he arranged a private meeting through her assistant. A business matter, he claimed, knowing she wouldn't refuse something professional. He chose a private room at his most exclusive restaurant, ensuring they'd be undisturbed. When she arrived, she was all business. Tailored suit, perfect makeup, not a hint of the vulnerability he'd once known. She sat across from him, maintaining a careful distance. "What was so urgent it required a private meeting?" she asked, her tone clipped. Giovanni stood, moving around the table toward her. "You know why you're here." "If this isn't about business." He grabbed her arm as she started to rise, his grip firm but not painful. "Stop running from me." "Let go." Her voice was steady, but he could feel the tension in her muscles. "Not until you listen." She yanked her arm free, her eyes blazing. "Listen to what? More lies? More manipulation?" "To the truth." His control slipped, voice rising. He moved closer, crowding her space. "To how I feel about—" "How you feel?" She pushed against his chest, creating distance between them. "Your feelings stopped mattering to me the moment I heard you laughing about our marriage with your friends." Elisa walked out of her yoga studio, gym bag slung over her shoulder. The afternoon sun beat down on the busy street, and she paused to check her phone. 3 missed calls from Giovanni. She deleted the notifications without a second thought. The black SUV pulled up beside her so smoothly she barely noticed it. But years of living in Giovanni's world had taught her to stay alert. She caught the reflection of 2 men approaching in a store window, their movements too purposeful to be casual pedestrians. Her muscles tensed, but she kept walking, her pace steady. The studio was only 2 blocks from her new apartment. She could make it. A hand grabbed her arm. "Mrs. De Luca, you'll be coming with us." Elisa didn't hesitate. She dropped her gym bag and swung her elbow back, catching the first man in the throat. Her trainer would have been proud. All those self-defense classes were paying off. The second man lunged for her. She ducked, but a third grabbed her from behind. The sidewalk erupted in chaos as pedestrians scattered. Someone screamed. "Stop fighting," the man holding her hissed. "We don't want to hurt you." Elisa laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "That's your first mistake." She went limp in his arms, throwing off his balance. As he adjusted his grip, she drove her heel into his instep and twisted free. The first man had recovered, reaching for her again. She let him get close, then drove her knee up between his legs. The SUV's door slid open. More men emerged. 5 against 1 now. Elisa backed away, calculating her options. She could run, but they'd catch her.
She could scream, but in this neighborhood, no one would help. "Mrs. DeLuca," one of them said, his tone almost respectful. "This doesn't have to get messy. Your husband needs to learn a lesson."
And you think taking me will teach him?
She kept her voice steady, buying time. Her phone was still in her hand. Behind her back, her fingers found the emergency contact button Giovanni had installed. "We know about the bet," another man said. "We know he married you for money. Why protect him?" A cloth pressed against her face before she could answer. The sweet smell of chloroform filled her nostrils. As her vision blurred, Elisa managed one last act of defiance. She bit down hard on the hand holding the cloth, tasting blood. "Crazy bitch!" the man cursed. The world tilted sideways. As consciousness slipped away, Elisa smiled. They thought they were taking Giovanni's weak spot, his vulnerable point. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Across town, Giovanni sat in his office reviewing territory agreements. His phone buzzed, the emergency alert he'd set up for Elisa. His blood turned to ice as he watched the GPS signal moving rapidly away from her usual route. "Boss," his right-hand man burst through the door. "There's been an incident outside the yoga studio. Witnesses say—" "They took her." Giovanni's voice was deadly calm. He stood slowly, straightening his suit jacket. The movement was controlled, but his eyes promised violence. His men watched nervously as he walked to the window, staring out at the city that belonged to him. In the reflection, they saw what their enemies would
soon learn. Giovanni DeLuca wasn't just a man who'd married for a bet anymore. He was a man in love, and someone had just taken what was his. "Call everyone," he ordered. "I want eyes on every street, every camera. Find her." "Boss, maybe we should—" Giovanni turned, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "They think they can use her to get to me? Fine. Let them see exactly what that means." He picked up his phone, dialing a number he rarely used. "It's time to call in every favor, every contact, every killer who owes me. I want this city turned upside down." The phone crackled with static as his order was acknowledged. Giovanni's fingers traced the edge of his desk, imagining instead the necks of the men who dared to touch what was his. What had started as a bet had become something else entirely, and now they would all learn the cost of that mistake. The cell door creaked open, and Elisa's eyes adjusted to the dim light. Her wrists burned from the rope they'd used to bind her, but she'd worked one hand loose during the long hours of waiting. The transformation of her body hadn't just been about looking good. It had made her stronger, more capable. Footsteps approached, heavy boots on concrete. She kept her head down, playing the role they expected, the weak, terrified wife. "Time to make a phone call to your husband," a gruff voice announced. Elisa didn't move. The man stepped closer, reaching for her arm. In one fluid motion, she brought her freed hands up, driving the heel of her palm into his nose. Cartilage crunched. He stumbled backward, blood streaming down his face. "You little—" He lunged for her. Elisa was already moving. Months of training had taught her how to use her body efficiently. She ducked under his grab, driving her knee into his stomach. The man doubled over, and she brought her elbow down on the back of his neck. He crumpled to the floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she checked the hallway. Empty. They hadn't expected their captive to fight back. Why would they? She was just Giovanni's trophy wife, the fat girl he'd married for a bet. The thought fueled her anger. She grabbed the guard's gun and phone, moving silently through the dim corridor. Voices echoed from somewhere ahead. 3, maybe 4 men. She could hear them laughing, probably thinking they had Giovanni De Luca exactly where they wanted him. Elisa smiled grimly. They had no idea what they were dealing with. The old Elisa might have waited to be rescued, but she wasn't that girl anymore. She found a window at the end of the hall. 3rd floor, but there was a fire escape. As she worked the rusty latch open, a shout went up behind her. They'd found the unconscious guard. "Stop right there!" A man appeared at the end of the hallway, gun raised. Elisa didn't hesitate. She fired 2 shots, not to kill, but to force him back, and dove through the window. The metal grating of the fire escape rattled under her feet, ran down. Bullets pinged off the railings around her. She reached the 2nd floor when one of them caught up to her. He grabbed her hair, yanking her backward. Elisa drove her elbow into his ribs, then twisted, using his momentum to throw him against the railing. The man lost his balance, tumbling over the edge with a cry. Blood trickled down her arm from where a bullet had grazed her. The pain barely registered. She kept moving, jumping the last few feet to the ground. Her legs absorbed the impact. Thank God for all those squats. More shouting from above. Elisa ran, weaving through the maze of abandoned warehouses. She could hear engines starting, car doors slamming. They were coming after her. She ducked into a doorway, checking the phone she'd taken. No signal. Of course not. She was on her own. A car engine roared nearby. Elisa pressed herself against the wall, controlling her breathing like she'd learned in yoga. The vehicle passed without stopping. She waited another moment, then moved again, staying in the shadows. The sound of gunfire erupted in the distance. Different caliber weapons. This wasn't just her pursuers anymore. Giovanni had found them. Elisa made her way toward the noise, keeping to cover. She found a metal pipe lying in the debris and picked it up. Better than nothing. 2 men ran past her hiding spot, distracted by the firefight ahead. Elisa stepped out behind them, swinging the pipe. One went down hard. The other turned, but she was already moving, driving her knee up into his groin. He collapsed with a wheeze. She heard the distinctive sound of Giovanni's favorite gun, a custom Desert Eagle. He was close. Elisa moved toward the sound, her borrowed gun ready. The door of the warehouse burst open. Giovanni stood there, his suit spattered with blood, his eyes wild with a mixture of rage and fear. He froze when he saw her, standing over 2 unconscious men, bloodied but unbroken. The look in his eyes shifted from fear to something else entirely. Recognition, respect, and something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. Under the moonlight, Giovanni drove with a quiet intensity, hands gripping the wheel as if the force could anchor his turbulent thoughts. Elisa, sitting beside him, kept her eyes forward. The silence between them was heavy with unsaid words. The mansion loomed into view, its opulence stark against the night. As they stepped inside, Giovanni's demeanor softened. He paused, turning to her with an unfamiliar vulnerability etched into his features. "You need a doctor." His voice, usually commanding, was laced with genuine concern. "I've had worse," Elisa replied, downplaying the ache in her arm. Giovanni's jaw tightened, torn between respect for her strength and the impulse to shelter her from any harm. He led Elisa to the living room, its lush furnishings now bearing witness to this new chapter in their relationship. The pendant lights cast a warm glow on the leather couch where Giovanni motioned for her to sit. As he retrieved a first aid kit from a cabinet, Elisa watched him, noting the careful way he handled the gauze and antiseptic.
His hands, usually so adept at managing the violent aspects of his life, now moved gently over her wound. Elisa flinched at the sting, but Giovanni's eyes met hers, grounding her with the intensity of his concern. There was no denying the shift. His armor was cracking. "I'm sorry." The words escaped him unexpectedly. The apology, hanging in the air, resonated with something deeper than guilt. She studied him.
Giovanni De Luca saying sorry. I didn't think I'd live to see it.
His lips curved into a reluctant smile. "You make me wish I wasn't the man I am." Elisa's gaze remained steady, unyielding in its scrutiny.
Then stop trying to be someone else. Just be real with me.
Giovanni nodded, the significance of her words settling over him. "I've been afraid, you know."
Afraid?
Elisa echoed, skeptically. The idea of Giovanni fearing anything seemed incongruent. "Afraid of losing you," he admitted, the confession raw.
I can't stand the thought of it.
Elisa shifted, her expression softening even as she maintained her guard. The tenderness in Giovanni's eyes was new ground. She wasn't ready to tread it blindly.
I'm not making promises, Giovanni.
He accepted her words, understanding that trust was not something to be demanded. For the first time, they fell into silence that wasn't filled with tension or recrimination, but an understanding of their shared uncertainty. The quiet stretched, nurturing a fragile flame between them, kindling something neither could yet define. As the clock ticked softly in the corner, their world shrunk to this room, this moment, rich in possibilities untold. The morning sun filtered through the mansion's bulletproof windows, casting long shadows across Giovanni's study. He stood before his desk, shoulders tense as he read through another threatening message. The third one this week. Elisa watched from the doorway, noting how his fingers clenched around the paper. She'd learned to read his body language over their months together, the slight twitch in his jaw, the way his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Something was wrong. "They're getting bolder," Giovanni muttered, more to himself than to her. He crumpled the paper and tossed it into the fireplace, watching it burn with cold fury in his eyes.
"Tell me,"
Elisa said, stepping into the room. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor, a sound that used to make Giovanni look up with irritation. Now, he turned to her with something closer to relief. "My enemies think they've found my weakness." He gestured to the burning paper.
"They're threatening to hurt you to get to me. And some of my own people."
He paused, jaw clenching.
"They're starting to question my leadership."
Elisa moved closer, her transformation evident in the confident way she carried herself. No longer the timid woman who'd agreed to his marriage proposal, she now commanded attention with every step.
"Let me help," she said, her voice steady. "I can do more than just stand by and watch." Giovanni's laugh was bitter. "This isn't your fight, Elisa." "It became my fight when they used me against you." She perched on the edge of his desk, meeting his gaze. "I'm not the same woman you made that bet about, Giovanni. I can handle myself." He studied her face, remembering how she'd fought off her kidnappers. The memory still burned, finding her there, bloodied but unbroken. "What are you suggesting?" "Your enemies think I'm your weakness. Let's use that against them." Elisa's eyes gleamed with determination. "I can get close to them, gather information. They won't suspect me. They still see me as the woman you married for a bet." Giovanni's protective instincts flared. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous." "More dangerous than sitting here waiting for them to strike?" she challenged. "I've changed, Giovanni. I'm stronger now. Smarter. Let me prove it." He moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheek. The gesture was possessive, protective, but there was something else there too. Respect. "If anything happens to you," he started. "It won't," she interrupted. "I've learned from watching you. I know how to play this game." Giovanni's world had always been black and white, enemies and allies, power and weakness. But Elisa had brought color into his life, shades of gray he never expected to find. She was right. She wasn't the same woman he'd married for that stupid bet. "We do this together," he finally said, his voice rough. "No solo missions, no unnecessary risks." Elisa nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "I can work with that." They spent the next hour planning, Elisa proving her worth as she pointed out angles Giovanni hadn't considered. She knew which of his associates' wives gossiped the most, which restaurants his enemies frequented, details that could give them an edge. "Your enemies think I'm just arm candy," she said, marking locations on a map of the city. "They won't notice me gathering intel at social events. And their wives," she smiled, the expression sharp. "They love to talk to the new girl in town." Giovanni watched her work, pride mixing with something deeper. She moved with purpose, her intelligence shining through as she outlined their strategy. This was the woman who'd emerged from the ashes of his betrayal. Stronger, deadlier, more beautiful than ever. As they finalized their plans, the dynamic between them shifted yet again. They were no longer just husband and wife in name, or predator and prey in a game of power. They were partners, equals in a dangerous dance that could cost them everything. The mansion was quiet, save for the crackling fireplace in Giovanni's study. Moonlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the room. Elisa sat curled in one of the leather armchairs, a glass of wine in her hand, while Giovanni stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the night sky. "I never wanted this life," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, rougher than usual. "Being born into the family meant I had no choice. Every decision was made for me before I could walk." Elisa watched him over the rim of her glass, noting how his shoulders carried the weight of his words. She'd never seen him like this, guard down, walls crumbling. "The bet." He turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "It was stupid, cruel. I did it because that's what was expected of me. The ruthless boss, playing with people's lives like they meant nothing." The mention of the bet still stung, but Elisa remained silent, letting him speak. This was the most honest he'd been since their marriage began. "I saw you back then, you know," he continued, moving closer to where she sat. "The quiet girl who used to watch me from across the room. I pretended not to notice because noticing meant feeling something. And in my world, feelings get you killed." Elisa set her wine glass down, her heart beating faster as Giovanni knelt before her chair. His proximity made her breath catch. They'd been close before, but never like this, never with such raw honesty between them. "When you transformed yourself," he said, his hand reaching for hers, "I told myself it was just physical attraction, that I could control it. But seeing you fight back against my enemies, watching you become this incredible force." He squeezed her fingers. "You terrify me, Elisa." She raised an eyebrow. "The great Giovanni De Luca, terrified?"
Because I can't control how I feel about you anymore.
His confession hung in the air between them.
Every time I try to push you away, you come back stronger. When those men took you,
His jaw clenched at the memory.
I realized I'd rather die than lose you.
Elisa's free hand moved to his face, tracing the sharp line of his jaw. She felt him lean into her touch, his usual coldness melting away.
I was so angry when I found out about the bet, she whispered. Not just because you saw me as nothing, but because I'd loved you for so long, secretly, quietly, watching you become this powerful man who would never look twice at the fat girl in the corner.
Giovanni caught her hand, pressing his lips to her palm.
I was a fool. Yes, you were.
But there was no bite in her words anymore.
I changed myself because I wanted to hurt you, to make you regret ever underestimating me.
And now? His eyes met hers, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before.
Now,
Elisa leaned forward, her face inches from his.
Now I know that the man behind the mask is worth more than any bet.
Giovanni's breath hitched as she closed the distance between them. Her lips met his softly at first, a gentle exploration.
That quickly deepened into something more urgent. His hands tangled in her hair as she slid from the chair into his lap, their bodies pressing together like they were made to fit. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Giovanni rested his forehead against hers. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Maybe not, she agreed, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. But you have my understanding. And maybe... She kissed him again, briefly. Maybe that's worth more. The fire crackled behind them, casting warm light over their entwined forms as they held each other, neither willing to break the spell of vulnerability that had settled over them. For the first time since their marriage began, both their masks had slipped away, leaving only truth between them. Giovanni's office was deathly quiet as he stared at the surveillance photos spread across his mahogany desk. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge, the evidence before him undeniable. Marco, his right-hand man for the past decade, was caught on camera meeting with his rivals just days before Elisa's kidnapping. Are you absolutely certain? Giovanni's voice was eerily calm, but Elisa could see the storm brewing in his eyes. His security chief nodded. The photos are time-stamped. We traced the money transfers. Marco's been feeding them information for months. Elisa stood by the window, watching Giovanni's reflection in the glass. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. Marco had been at their wedding, had shared meals at their table, had been trusted with their most intimate secrets. Leave us, Giovanni ordered. The security chief quickly departed, closing the door behind him. Elisa turned to face her husband. I remember Marco checking on me that morning. He knew my schedule, knew exactly when I'd be vulnerable. Giovanni's jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck strained against his collar as he picked up one of the photos. He was at my father's funeral. Held me up when I could barely stand. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. And he sold you to my enemies. What are you going to do? Elisa asked, though she already knew the answer. Giovanni's dark eyes met hers. What I should have done the moment they touched you. He reached for his phone, dialing a number with deliberate precision. Bring him in. Now. The next hour passed in tense silence. Elisa watched Giovanni pace his office like a caged animal, his usual controlled demeanor cracking with each passing minute. When heavy footsteps finally echoed down the hallway, Giovanni's entire body went rigid. The door opened, and Marco was shoved inside by two of Giovanni's men. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usual confidence replaced by barely concealed fear.
Giovanni,
Marco started, forcing a smile.
there must be some mistake.
Shut up. Giovanni's voice could have frozen hell itself. How much did they pay you? Marco's eyes darted to Elisa, then back to Giovanni.
I don't know what you're
Talking about. Giovanni moved with lightning speed, his fist connecting with Marco's jaw. The crack echoed through the office as Marco stumbled backward. How much? Giovanni demanded again. Blood trickled from Marco's split lip.
2 million,
he spat.
They offered 2 million to help take you down.
By using my wife? Giovanni's control snapped. He grabbed Marco by the throat, slamming him against the wall. You put her life at risk for money? Elisa watched, transfixed by the raw fury emanating from her husband. This wasn't the calculated violence she'd witnessed before. This was pure, primal rage.
You were getting soft,
Marco choked out.
The family was whispering about it. The great Giovanni De Luca wrapped around some woman's finger. You needed to be taught a lesson.
Giovanni's grip tightened. A lesson. His laugh was hollow, dangerous. Then let me teach you one about loyalty. The next few moments were a blur of violence. Giovanni's fists connected again and again, each blow carrying years of betrayal. Marco's expensive suit turned crimson, his face unrecognizable under the assault. Elisa couldn't look away. This was Giovanni in his purest form, the ruthless mafia boss who'd built his empire on blood and fear. But for the first time, his violence wasn't about power or control. It was about protecting her. When Marco finally slumped to the ground, barely conscious, Giovanni stepped back. His knuckles were raw and bleeding, his shirt spattered with red. He turned to his men, who had watched the beating in silence. Take him to the warehouse, Giovanni ordered. Make sure he understands exactly what happens to traitors in this family. As Marco was dragged away, Giovanni finally looked at Elisa. His eyes were still dark with rage, but something else flickered there too. Concern, maybe even fear of her reaction to his brutality. But Elisa didn't flinch. She crossed the room, taking his bloodied hands in hers.
No one will ever hurt me again,
she said softly. It wasn't a question. No, Giovanni agreed, his voice rough with emotion. They won't live long enough to try. Giovanni's black Aston Martin tore through the rain-slicked streets of the city, its engine growling like a predator. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles still raw and bruised from Marco's beating. Beside him, Elisa sat in tense silence, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The first target was Angelo Rossi's restaurant, a front for his illegal operations and the place where the kidnapping had been planned. Giovanni had received the confirmation an hour ago. Everyone involved would be there tonight, celebrating what they thought was their successful plan to destabilize his empire. Stay in the car, Giovanni ordered as he pulled into a dark alley behind the restaurant. Elisa's hand caught his arm.
No, I want to see this.
He studied her face, seeing the same determination that had helped her escape her captors. After a moment, he nodded. Stay, behind me. They moved through the rain like shadows. Two of Giovanni's men were already in position, having disabled the security cameras and taken care of the guards. The back door opened silently to his touch. Music and laughter drifted from the private dining room. Giovanni recognized Angelo's booming voice, along with several others who had dared to move against him. His hand tightened on his gun. 8 men, he whispered to Elisa, all armed. When this starts, I know what to do. She cut him off, her voice steady. Giovanni kicked the door open, and chaos erupted. The first 2 men didn't even have time to reach for their weapons before his bullets found them. Angelo dove for cover, screaming orders as glasses shattered and women screamed. Gunfire exploded across the room. Giovanni moved with lethal precision, each shot finding its mark. He caught glimpses of Elisa behind an overturned table, her face set in grim determination as she watched the carnage unfold. "You're dead, De Luca!" Angelo shouted, firing wildly. "We should have killed your whore when we had the chance!" The words ignited something primal in Giovanni's chest. He vaulted over a table, closing the distance between them in seconds. His fist connected with Angelo's face, sending the man sprawling. "You touched what's mine," Giovanni snarled, pressing his gun to Angelo's temple. "You tried to take her from me." "She made you weak," Angelo spat blood. "The great Giovanni De Luca, brought low by a woman." Giovanni's laugh was cold. "No, she made me stronger." The gunshot echoed through the room. When the silence finally fell, only bodies remained. Giovanni stood in the center of the destruction, his suit splattered with blood, his breathing heavy. He turned to find Elisa watching him with an unreadable expression. "This isn't over," he said, reaching for her hand. "There are others." Over the next 24 hours, Giovanni unleashed hell on everyone who had played a part in the plot against them. Safe houses were raided, businesses burned, and messages sent in blood across the city. His reputation for ruthlessness had always been feared, but this was different. This was personal. The final target was a warehouse by the docks, where the last of his enemies had gathered in desperate defense. Giovanni's men surrounded the building as dawn broke over the water. "They're trapped," his lieutenant reported. "No way out." Giovanni nodded, feeling Elisa's presence beside him. "Burn it." The warehouse went up in flames, the screams inside drowned out by the roar of the fire. Giovanni watched impassively as his empire was cleansed of those who had dared to challenge him, who had dared to threaten what was his. When it was over, he stood among the ashes, his clothes stained with smoke and blood. Elisa approached him slowly, her eyes reflecting the dying flames. In that moment, looking at her, Giovanni felt something shift inside him. A final acceptance of what he'd been fighting all along. He reached for her, his touch gentler than it had been in days. "You're mine, Elisa," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Forever." The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Giovanni's office, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Elisa stood at the threshold, watching him work. His shoulders were tense as he reviewed documents, probably damage reports from the previous day's carnage. She moved into the room without hesitation, her heels clicking against the floor. Giovanni looked up, his dark eyes softening at the sight of her. The transformation in him was subtle but unmistakable. Gone was the cold indifference that had marked their early days together. "The Russo family called," Elisa said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "They want to negotiate new terms." Giovanni's lip curled. They were quick to distance themselves from Angelo. "Smart of them." Elisa crossed her legs, the movement drawing his attention. "I took the liberty of drafting a preliminary agreement. They'll pay more for protection now, of course." Pride flickered across Giovanni's features.
She was no longer the woman he'd married for a bet. She had become something more, someone who understood his world, who could navigate its treacherous waters with the same skill he possessed. "Show me," he said, pushing aside his papers. Elisa pulled out her tablet, moving around the desk to stand beside him. As she explained the terms she'd outlined, Giovanni's hand found its way to the small of her back, a possessive touch that sent warmth through her body. "You've thought of everything," he murmured, scanning the document, "including the shipping routes they tried to hide from us."
Did you expect anything less?
There was a hint of challenge in her voice. Giovanni turned his chair to face her fully, pulling her between his legs. "No, not anymore." His hands slid up her thighs, and Elisa allowed herself to enjoy the touch. The fear that had once accompanied his presence was gone, replaced by something electric, something powerful. She was his equal now, and they both knew it.
Show me the rest, she said, stepping back. All of it, Giovanni. No more secrets.
He studied her for a long moment before nodding. Standing, he took her hand and led her from the office. They moved through the mansion, past armed guards who nodded respectfully at them both, into areas Elisa had never seen before. The first stop was his private vault, where ledgers detailed every aspect of his criminal empire. Giovanni showed her the complex network of businesses, both legitimate and illegal, that formed the backbone of his power. Elisa absorbed it all, asking questions that revealed her sharp mind and strategic thinking. Next came the weapons room, a stark reminder of the violence that underpinned their world. Elisa ran her fingers along a sleek pistol, remembering the sound of gunfire in Angelo's restaurant. "You'll need to learn,"
Giovanni said, watching her. "For protection." "I already know," she replied, picking up the gun with practiced ease. "I've been taking lessons for months." Something dark and appreciative flashed in Giovanni's eyes. He moved behind her, adjusting her stance slightly, his breath warm against her neck. "Show me." At the private shooting range, Elisa demonstrated her skills, hitting target after target with precision that made Giovanni's breath catch. She was magnificent, dangerous and beautiful, and entirely his. Later, they sat in his private study, sharing a bottle of wine as darkness fell over the city. Elisa curled into the leather sofa, her feet tucked under her, while Giovanni sat beside her, his arm draped possessively across her shoulders. "There's more to show you," he said, his fingers tracing patterns on her skin. "The international operations, the political connections." "We have time," Elisa replied, turning to face him. "I'm not going anywhere." The truth of her words settled between them. She wasn't just his wife anymore. She was his partner, his equal, someone who could stand beside him in both the darkness and the light of his world. Together, they would be unstoppable. Giovanni pulled her closer, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of possession and promise. When they parted, Elisa saw her own power reflected in his eyes, and she smiled, knowing their journey together was only beginning. The evening sun cast long shadows across Giovanni's study as Elisa stood by the window, watching the guards patrol the grounds below. The weight of her decision pressed heavily on her shoulders. Everything had changed since that fateful day she'd overheard the bet. She'd transformed from the overlooked girl into a woman of power and influence. Giovanni's reflection appeared in the window behind her. He kept his distance, something he'd never done before. The space between them crackled with unspoken tension. "You don't have to stay," he said, his voice low and controlled. "The bet is over. You've more than proved yourself." Elisa turned, studying the man who'd both broken and rebuilt her heart.
Gone was the cold mafioso who'd married her for money. In his place stood someone different, someone who looked at her with equal parts desire and respect.
Is that what you want?
She asked, lifting her chin.
For me to leave?
Giovanni's jaw tightened. What I want stopped mattering the moment I made that bet. This has to be your choice, Elisa. She moved to his desk, running her fingers over the papers there. Contracts, weapon shipment schedules, property deeds. Evidence of the empire they'd been building together.
And if I choose to stay?
Then you accept everything that comes with it. He stepped closer, his presence filling the room. The violence, the danger, the enemies who'll never stop coming for us.
Like Angelo?
A smile played at her lips.
We handled him well enough.
That was different. You were in danger.
And I fought back, she interrupted. I'm not the same woman you married, Giovanni. I don't need your protection anymore.
His eyes darkened with desire and pride. No, you don't. Elisa approached him slowly, remembering how far they'd come. The betrayal that had started it all had forged her into something stronger, something deadlier. And Giovanni, he'd changed too, learning to see her as an equal rather than a possession.
Show me again, she demanded softly. Show me what staying means.
Without hesitation, Giovanni led her down to the basement level of the mansion. The steel door opened to reveal their command center, screens displaying security feeds, communications equipment, and a wall of weapons that would make any military force envious. This would be yours too, he said, watching her reaction carefully. Equal access, equal control. No more secrets between us. Elisa moved through the room, taking in every detail. This was the heart of Giovanni's power, the control center from which he managed his criminal empire. And he was offering to share it all with her.
The other families won't like it, she mused. A woman with this much power.
They'll learn to accept it. His voice carried the promise of violence. Or they'll suffer the consequences. She turned to face him, seeing the man who'd once viewed her as nothing more than a means to win a bet. Now he looked at her with something deeper, something that made her breath catch.
And us? She asked. What happens to us if I stay?
Giovanni closed the distance between them, his hand coming up to cup her face. The tenderness of the gesture contrasted sharply with the dangerous world around them. We rule together, he said simply. Equal partners in everything. No more bets, no more games. Elisa leaned into his touch, feeling the calluses on his fingers, evidence of the violent life he led. A life that had become hers as well, whether she'd intended it or not.
I should hate you, she whispered, for what you did, for how this started.
But you don't. It wasn't a question.
No.
She met his gaze steadily.
I don't.
The admission hung between them, heavy with possibility. This was the moment of choice. She could walk away, return to a normal life free from the darkness of his world. Or she could stay, embracing the power and danger and passion they'd built together. Elisa's heels clicked against the marble floor as she descended the grand staircase of their mansion. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, catching on the diamond ring that now meant something more than a bet. Giovanni stood at the bottom, his dark suit impeccable as always, but his eyes held a warmth that would have been unthinkable months ago. The Castellano family has arrived, he said, extending his hand to her. They're waiting in the study. She took his hand, feeling the familiar surge of electricity at his touch.
Are they ready to accept the new arrangement?
They'll have to be.
His thumb traced circles on her palm, a subtle gesture of intimacy that made her breath catch. You've earned your place here, more than any of them. They walked together through the corridors of power that had once seemed so foreign to her. Now, every guard they passed nodded respectfully, not just to Giovanni, but to her as well. The transformation was complete, from the overlooked girl to a woman who commanded respect in this dangerous world. The study door opened to reveal 3 men in expensive suits, their faces grave with old-world tradition. They rose as Elisa entered alongside Giovanni, though she caught the slight hesitation in their movements. Old habits died hard in their world. "Gentlemen," Giovanni's voice carried the weight of authority, "my wife will be joining us for all future negotiations." Marco Castellano, the eldest, raised an eyebrow. "This is unprecedented, Giovanni. Our business—"
Our business, Elisa cut in smoothly, will benefit from a fresh perspective.
She moved to sit at Giovanni's right hand, her posture elegant but unyielding.
Unless you object to the family that helped dismantle the Angelo conspiracy.
The men shifted uncomfortably, remembering how she'd not only survived her kidnapping, but helped orchestrate their enemy's downfall. Giovanni's hand found hers under the table, a silent gesture of pride and support. "The world is changing," Giovanni continued, his tone brooking no argument. "Elisa isn't just my wife. She's my partner in every sense. The families that accept this will prosper. Those that don't—" He left the threat hanging in the air. Elisa watched the men exchange glances, seeing the moment they realized this wasn't a request. She'd fought too hard, changed too much to be dismissed now. The strength Giovanni had always possessed was matched by her own now, tempered by the trials they'd faced together. "Very well," Marco conceded, though his eyes held new respect as he looked at Elisa. "Let's discuss the merger." The meeting proceeded, with Elisa's insights proving invaluable. She caught Giovanni watching her several times, his dark eyes filled with pride and something deeper, the love that had grown from the ashes of their beginning. Hours later, as the Castellanos departed, Giovanni pulled Elisa into his private office. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, but nothing could dim the fire between them. He traced the line of her jaw with his finger, the gesture possessive yet tender. "You were magnificent," he murmured. "Everything I never knew I needed." Elisa leaned into his touch, remembering the long path that had brought them here.
Did you ever imagine, when you made that bet, that this is where we'd end up?
No. His honesty was refreshing. I was a fool then, thinking I could control you, own you. His hands slid to her waist, pulling her closer. Now I know better. You're not something to be possessed. You're my equal, my match in every way. She
reached up to loosen his tie, a familiar gesture that now carried the weight of their shared history. "And you're not the same man who made that bet. We've both changed." His lips found hers, the kiss deep and claiming, yet different from the desperate encounters of their past. This was a kiss of belonging, of 2 people who had fought their way to each other through betrayal and danger. When they parted, Elisa saw their reflection in the window. No longer the calculating Mafia boss and his bet-won bride, but 2 people who had forged something powerful from pain. Giovanni's empire had expanded, strengthened by their partnership, while their love had deepened into something neither had believed possible. Elisa sat beside Giovanni at the head of the massive mahogany table, her fingers tracing the smooth wood as she listened to the reports. The room buzzed with tension as their captains detailed the cleanup operations following their victory over their enemies. Her presence there, equal to Giovanni's, spoke volumes about how much had changed. "The Angelo family's assets have been completely liquidated," Marco reported, sliding a folder across the table. "Their territories are secure." Giovanni's hand found hers under the table, a subtle gesture that still sent warmth through her body. She remembered a time when such contact would have been unthinkable, when she was nothing more than a bet to him. Now, his touch carried the weight of everything they'd survived together. "And their remaining associates?" Elisa asked, her voice carrying the authority that had become natural to her. "Dealt with," Marco replied, his respect evident in his tone. "No loose ends." Giovanni's thumb traced circles on her palm as he spoke. "Good. We'll need to restructure the distribution routes through their old territory." His dark eyes flickered to Elisa. "Your suggestion about the dock workers proved invaluable." She nodded, remembering how her insight had helped them outmaneuver their enemies. The old Elisa would have shrunk from such praise, but now she owned her power. "The unions are loyal to us now. We'll have no trouble maintaining control." The meeting continued, with Elisa and Giovanni working in perfect sync. Where he was fire and fury, she brought calculation and strategy. Their complementary strengths had transformed his empire into something more formidable than ever. As their captains filed out, Elisa felt Giovanni's gaze on her. She'd learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the slight softening around his eyes that only she got to see, the way his jaw relaxed when they were alone. "You're thinking too hard," she said, rising from her chair. Her fitted dress highlighted the body she'd worked so hard to achieve, but now it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about owning who she'd become. Giovanni stood, moving behind her with the fluid grace of a predator. "I'm thinking about how far we've come." His hands settled on her.
Waste, possessive yet gentle. About the woman who turned my world upside down.
Elisa leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart.
"You mean the woman you bet on?"
There was no bitterness in her voice now. They'd moved past that pain to something deeper. "The woman who proved me wrong in every way possible." His lips brushed her neck. "Who fought her way to stand beside me, not behind me." She turned in his arms, studying the face she'd once watched from afar. The cold mask he showed the world was gone, replaced by something raw and real. "We fought our way here together." His fingers traced the curve of her jaw, his touch reverent. "You changed everything, Elisa. My world, my empire." His voice dropped lower. "My heart." The admission, so simple yet profound, made her breath catch. This was the man who had once seen her as nothing more than a means to win a bet, now looking at her like she held his world in her hands. "Show me the latest territory reports," she said, maintaining their balance of business and intimacy. "We need to ensure the transition is smooth." He smiled, appreciating how she matched his drive for control and success. They moved to his private office, where maps and documents covered his desk. As they worked side by side, their shoulders touching, Elisa felt the rightness of it all. This was where she belonged, not as the girl who'd been bet upon, but as the woman who turned that bet into an empire. Giovanni's hand found the small of her back as they studied the maps together, his touch both possessive and respectful. "Your insight about the dock workers' families," he murmured. "It wasn't just strategic. You saw what I missed, that loyalty comes from protection, not just fear."
Elisa nodded, remembering how she'd suggested supporting the workers' families, ensuring their children had good schools and their wives had security.
Fear makes enemies. Love makes allies.
His arms wrapped around her from behind, his chest solid against her back. "You taught me that," he whispered in her ear. "You're more than I ever imagined." Giovanni watched Elisa move through his office with practiced ease, her fingers trailing over the leather-bound ledgers she'd helped organize. The afternoon sun caught her silhouette, illuminating how far she'd come from the woman he'd once foolishly wagered on. Her transformation wasn't just physical. It was in every confident step, every calculated decision. "The Santiago family is requesting a meeting," she said, picking up a document from his desk. Her business attire was impeccable, a dark blue suit that commanded respect. "They're interested in our protection services." Giovanni leaned back in his chair, observing how naturally she'd adapted to their world. "What's your read on them?"
Their books are clean, but their territory is vulnerable. The recent gang activity in their area makes them an easy target.
She placed the file in front of him, leaning against
his desk. "We could offer them what they need, and in return gain access to their shipping routes." He nodded, impressed by her strategic thinking. "Set up the meeting. I want you there." "Already done. Thursday at 2. A small smile played at her lips. "I also took the liberty of having Marco look into their background. Everything checks out." This was what made them strong. Her ability to anticipate his needs, to think 3 steps ahead. She wasn't just his wife anymore. She was his partner in every sense of the word. "The Dock Workers Union representatives sent their gratitude," he mentioned, reaching for her hand. "Your education initiative for their children has secured their loyalty better than any threat could have." Elisa intertwined her fingers with his, her touch both professional and intimate. "Fear might control people, but it's care that keeps them loyal. We need them to want to protect our interests, not just fear the consequences of betrayal." Giovanni stood, moving to the window that overlooked their territory. The city stretched out before them, a kingdom they'd built together. "The other families are taking notice. They see how we've changed things." "Let them watch," Elisa said, joining him. "Our way works. The numbers prove it." He turned to face her, struck by the fierce intelligence in her eyes. This was the woman who'd turned his cold empire into something more, something stronger. "The Castellanos want to renegotiate their protection fees." "They're testing us," she replied immediately, "seeing if our new approach means we're soft." Her expression hardened. "We should remind them why that's a dangerous assumption." Giovanni felt pride surge through him. She understood the delicate balance of power and mercy, of strength and strategy. "What do you suggest?" "We'll meet with them," she said, moving to retrieve another file. "Show them our numbers, how their businesses have thrived under our protection. Then remind them what happened to the last family that tried to undermine us." Her suggestion was perfect, a blend of business sense and subtle threat. This was how they worked now, each bringing their strengths to the table. Where he brought decades of underground connections and raw power, she brought fresh perspective and diplomatic finesse. "Have dinner with me tonight," he said suddenly, pulling her close. "Just us, no business." She smiled, the kind of smile that still made his heart race. "You sure you can leave the Empire alone for one evening?" "The Empire is stronger than ever," he replied, his hand finding the small of her back. "Thanks to you." Their eyes met, and in that moment, all the power plays and business dealings faded away. They were just a man and woman who'd found each other through the most unlikely circumstances, who'd built something extraordinary together. "The meeting with the Santiagos," she said, maintaining their professional focus despite their proximity. "We should discuss our approach." "Later," he murmured, his fingers tracing her spine. "Right now, I want to appreciate how far we've come." Eliza nodded, understanding the weight of his words. They'd transformed his empire from a kingdom built on fear to one strengthened by loyalty and trust. Their partnership had become the foundation of something greater than either of them had imagined possible. Together, they turned back to the window, viewing their domain. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city. Their city. They'd built this together, not through the forced arrangement of a bet, but through genuine trust, respect, and partnership. The setting sun painted the private garden in shades of gold and crimson, casting long shadows across the immaculately maintained lawn. Giovanni and Eliza stood alone beneath an ancient oak tree, its branches spreading above them like a natural cathedral. The moment felt surreal. No witnesses, no elaborate ceremony, just two people who had fought their way to this point. Eliza wore a simple cream-colored dress that highlighted her transformed figure, but it was her eyes that commanded attention. They held the strength of everything she'd overcome, everything she'd become. Gone was the insecure woman who'd once overheard a cruel bet. In her place stood someone who had earned her power, her confidence, and most importantly, her love. Giovanni's usual imposing presence had softened, though his dark suit still spoke of authority. His eyes, typically cold and calculating, now held a warmth reserved only for her. He reached for her hands, his touch gentle but possessive. "I never thought I'd be here," he admitted, his voice low and intimate. "Standing before you, not because of a bet or obligation, but because I choose to. Because I need to." Eliza's fingers tightened around his. "We've come so far from that dinner table where you made that bet." She paused, a small smile playing at her lips. "I should thank you, you know. That bet gave me the push I needed to become who I am." "You were always this woman," Giovanni replied, bringing one hand up to cup her face. "I was too blind to see it, too caught up in my own world of power and control to recognize what was in front of me." The garden around them was silent except for the gentle rustle of leaves. This moment belonged to them alone. No mafia business, no threats, no power plays. Just truth. "I thought I knew everything about power," Giovanni continued, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "I built an empire on fear and violence. But you..." He shook his head, something like wonder in his expression. "You showed me real power, the kind that comes from transformation, from earning respect rather than demanding it." Eliza leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "And you showed me that love doesn't make you weak. It gives you something worth fighting for." The air between them crackled with intensity. Everything they'd been through, the bet, her transformation, the kidnapping, the battles, had led to this moment. Their journey had forged something unbreakable. "I vow to you," Giovanni's voice was thick with emotion, "that every day I will choose you. Not because of any bet or obligation, but because you are my equal, my partner, my heart." His hands trembled slightly, something no one else would ever witness. "I vow to protect not just your life, but your spirit, to never again take for granted the strength that lives inside you." Tears gathered in Eliza's eyes, but she held them back. She was no longer the woman who cried over betrayal.
I vow to stand beside you,
she responded, her voice steady and sure.
not as the woman you once dismissed, but as the one who challenged you, who fought you, who loved you even when it hurt. I vow to be your partner in everything, in business, in life, in love.
Giovanni pulled her closer, one hand sliding to the small of her back. You're more than I ever dreamed of having, he whispered. More than I deserve.
We deserve each other,
Elisa corrected him, her hands resting on his chest.
Every scar, every struggle, every victory. We've earned this.
The last rays of sunlight filtered through the oak leaves, casting dappled shadows across their faces. In this private moment, there was no Mafia empire, no power struggles, no past betrayals. There was only truth, only love, only them. Ti amo, Giovanni murmured, the Italian words carrying all the weight of their journey together. Forever, Elisa. No more games, no more bets, just us, building our empire together.
Ti amo anch'io,
she replied, her accent perfect from months of practice. Her hands slid up to frame his face, feeling the strength of his jaw, the warmth of his skin.
Forever.
The moonlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their bedroom, casting a silver glow across the marble floors. Elisa stood by the window, her silk nightgown flowing around her transformed figure, as she gazed out at the sprawling estate that was now as much hers as it was Giovanni's. The night was quiet, peaceful, a rare moment of tranquility in their usually turbulent world. Behind her, Giovanni moved silently, his footsteps barely audible on the polished floor. His presence, once intimidating, now brought her comfort. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. The warmth of his body seeped through the thin silk of her nightgown. What are you thinking about, cara mia? His voice was soft, intimate, a tone reserved only for her. Elisa leaned back into his embrace, her hands covering his where they rested on her stomach.
About how far we've come,
she replied, watching their reflection in the window glass.
From that bet to this moment.
Giovanni's grip tightened slightly, a reminder of how close he'd come to losing her. I was a fool, he murmured against her hair. A blind, arrogant fool who almost lost the most precious thing in his life. Turning in, his arms, Elisa reached up to trace the strong line of his jaw. Gone was the cold mask he usually wore, replaced by an openness that only she was privileged to see. His dark eyes, usually calculated and stern, now held a warmth that made her heart flutter.
We both needed that journey, she said softly. I needed to find my strength, and you needed to learn how to love.
Giovanni captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. You taught me everything about love, Elisa. How it can be both gentle and fierce. How it can make you stronger instead of weaker. The room around them spoke of luxury, rich fabrics, antique furniture, priceless art, but none of it compared to the wealth of having each other. Elisa remembered the days when she would have given anything just to have Giovanni look at her the way he was looking at her now.
Come to bed,
she whispered, leading him by the hand to their massive four-poster bed. The sheets were cool silk against their skin as they settled in together, Giovanni pulling her close against his chest. Do you remember? He asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her arm. The first time I saw you after your transformation began. I tried so hard to maintain my indifference. Elisa smiled against his chest.
You weren't as subtle as you thought. I caught you staring more than once.
How could I not stare? His hand slid down her side, appreciating the curves that she'd worked so hard to achieve. But it wasn't just your physical transformation that captivated me. It was your strength, your determination, the way you refused to let me control you. She propped herself up on an elbow to look at him, her long hair falling like a curtain around them.
You needed someone who would challenge you, Giovanni. Someone who wasn't afraid of your power.
His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. I needed you, Elisa. Just you. With all your fire and strength and love. The night wrapped around them like a protective cocoon, the world outside their bedroom forgotten. Here, they weren't the feared Mafia boss and his powerful wife. They were simply Giovanni and Elisa, two people who had fought through betrayal and violence to find their way to each other. Giovanni pulled her down for a kiss, slow and deep, pouring all his love and devotion into it. When they parted, he kept her close, their foreheads touching. You're my everything, he whispered, the words carrying all the weight of their shared history, all the promise of their future together. Elisa melted into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her palm. They had built an empire together, one founded not just on power and fear, but on trust and love. Their story had transformed from a cruel bet into something beautiful and unbreakable. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.